Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another S6 Political Science class. Please make yourselves comfortable. Today's recording is a continuation of our discussion of unitary systems, but in particular, we're going to look at devolution. So perhaps you can guess from the image that I have on this slide that we are going to talk about the components of um, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Why is that? Why are we going to talk about these things? I mean, the constituent parts of the UK. It's because perhaps they're the best examples of uh, devolved power and devolved bodies of government. Okay, as you will see in the course of this video. What is devolution? Devolution is really the transfer of power from a central authority, a central government, so for instance, the London Parliament, to subordinate regional institutions. So, in the context of this discussion, so subordinate regional institutions like the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Parliament, the Stormont Parliament. Okay, you can you can probably say that it's a kind of middle level. Devolution is kind of middle level between having a single central government, okay, that has all the power, and the existence of local governments that are there simply for implementation. Okay. Now these devolved powers are not co-equal to the center. They don't have they don't really share in sovereignty, or at the very least, not the same kind of sovereignty that the center has. Okay, so for instance, a good example would be the Stormont Parliament, the Northern Ireland Parliament. This doesn't have the same power as the London Parliament, okay, or Westminster. There are different kinds of devolution. We're going to talk about three of them. Administrative devolution, if you have this, if a government unit has administrative devolution, or has uh, administrative powers devolved from a central authority, then all they can do is to implement policy that was already decided elsewhere. Okay, so for instance, think about you know laws passed by the London Parliament. A devolved body would simply have to implement that. Okay, legislative devolution. This is also sometimes called home rule. So when you have this, then you're talking about an assembly, a regional assembly that has policy making powers up to a certain extent. Okay, so you can say that the legislative form of devolution, you know, um, gives a regional body the greatest possible measure of decision-making power, and also it would be a good example of a great degree of decentralization in a unitary system, as some of the powers originally reserved to the central authority is have been devolved to a local body. For instance, these are just examples of devolution. Spain was divided into 50 provinces, and these provinces can govern themselves. Also, there are 70 autonomous communities. So, there are government bodies that govern these provinces and these communities. In the UK, you have, as we mentioned in briefly before, you have devolved parliaments. Okay, some people would say it's a kind of quasi-federal system. Not really, but these parliaments I'm talking about, the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Northern Irish one, these bodies actually enjoy a great degree of democratic legitimacy because they are popular assemblies. They were elected into office. So members of these parliaments were elected into office, and these bodies were set up after referendums. So at least on paper, at least in principle, these are, you know, the the powers reserved to the London Parliament, the central authority, and then those powers that have been given to devolved parliaments or regional bodies. As you can see here, it's I think to some extent comparable to, the powers that are reserved to a federal government. So you have, general economic policy, taxation, foreign affairs, things like that. It's the national government that decides those things. And then perhaps you could say, especially with regard to services, with regard to welfare, these matters have been devolved to local or regional authorities. So education, health, transportation, environmental policy, and of course home affairs, if you're talking about, for instance, Scotland. And then things about local government, how things should be run, you know, how elections are done, etc. Um, you know, local taxation that can be part of it as well. But then, just to clarify, just to get into a little bit more detail. So we already said that Scotland has legislative devolution. So they have primary legislative power. What does that mean? That means that although they cannot really, for instance, impose or decide on income tax, they can vary it up to a certain point. Okay, so this means that laws on income tax are determined by Westminster, but then the Scottish Parliament can make variations to that, can vary it a little bit. Okay, up to a certain point. Actually, we're talking about up to a certain amount of money. Okay, and also the Scottish Parliament has passed laws on education. For instance, they fixed how much students have to pay at the universities, and also they have passed laws on healthcare relating to, for instance, more elderly people. Uh, the Scottish Parliament has gained broader powers, and if you remember, at a certain point, they were even able to, organize a referendum as to whether the Scots wanted to stay in the United Kingdom or not. Okay, and we know the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon was, in favor of this, and she was also in favor of what's this remaining in the EU. And after the Brexit referendum, there was talk of the Scots again, probably maybe deciding on whether they want to stay with the rest of the UK or not. And then you have Wales. At first, it only had secondary legislative power, so that means they couldn't raise taxes, and they could only vary laws made somewhere else, so passed by the London Parliament, but that was the extent of it. But there has been some development, and now, well, the Welsh Parliament has primary legislative powers. Now, Northern Ireland is a rather different case because originally they had powers like policing, security, powers over policing, security, prisons, criminal justice. These were originally powers that belonged to Westminster. But then uh, the powers of the Stormont Parliament, as it is also called, um, were suspended in the early 2000s. So this is what you call rolling devolution, that it was a possibility for this parliament, this regional body, to regain, okay, those powers, but only upon meeting certain conditions. So since there were security concerns, those powers were suspended. Once those security concerns were addressed, the powers were given back. So it's very clear that you know it's Westminster. It's the central authority that has power because it can suspend you know the powers of this regional body. Also, there was also a suspension again in 2017 until early 2020 because of a certain controversy. So it makes very that makes it very clear, which body actually has power, because these regional assemblies could lose those devolved powers. Okay, so I hope that is clear. I'm gonna end this recording here, and in the next recording, we're going to talk about regionalism. Okay, and that becomes a kind of introduction to our consideration of the European Union. I'll see you in our next class.